people will agree that climate change is not only one of the most serious public policy challenges that we face, it's in one way it's a unique challenge, right? We're dealing with especially temporal issues and global issues that are really unprecedented in our thinking about how to solve public policy problems and how to marry various values and interests and considerations together. And one of the things that's become quite common is just the complete dominance in the public policy realm of economic analysis. And you might even say, not just economic analysis, but sort of economic analysis that is driven by a kind of naive utilitarianism as a kind of political philosophy. And so what I have been curious about is what happens when we start thinking about a richer, more diverse, more pluralistic set of moral values and considerations when we start looking at public policy responses to climate change. So what is that going to start looking like? And then finally, we're having a very broad interdisciplinary conversation. We're having a very broad interdisciplinary conversation about what we should do about climate change, how to understand the wrongness of climate change impacts. And one of the questions I really wanted to bring these people, my panelists, up for is, what is the role of political theorists and political philosophers in that conversation? Because I have to say that for a long time, the answer resoundingly was there was no role for political philosophers and political theorists in this conversation. And I think, hopefully, we're going to show that there are reasons why we want to bring those people on board when talking about climate change. And so the structure of the event will be that each one of my three panelists will spend about 5 to 10 minutes laying out and discussing a particular set of moral considerations that have been undervalued and under-discussed in the current discussions about climate change. And hopefully some of my panelists will say a little bit about what political philosophy and political theory can do both in academia and outside of it. I know some of our panelists have a history of environmental activism, and so hopefully they will talk a little bit about that and sort of talk about their experiences in that context. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. And so Cory Katz, right here. Cory Caton is a doctoral candidate at St. Louis University. He's writing his dissertation under James Bowman on intergenerational domination. He has presented his work at Washington University, the American and Illinois Philosophical Associations, and the North American Society for Social Philosophy. And then next to Cory, to his right, is Ludvig Beckman, who is a professor of political science at Stockholm University in Sweden, where he works primarily in democratic theory, distributive justice, and their applications, including immigration, intergenerational justice, and children's rights. So he's quite the Renaissance man, figuratively speaking, in political theory. His recent books include The Territories of Citizenship and The Frontiers of Democracy, The Right to Vote and Its Limits. He has also published articles such as Democracy, National Responsibility, and Climate Change in the journal Democratization, Do global climate change and the interests of future generations have implications for democracy in the Journal of Environmental Politics, and Democracy and Future Generations, Should the Unborn Have a Voice, in the book Spheres of Global Justice. So I highly recommend that you check all of those out. And also, finally, he is the deputy chair of his department. So hopefully he can say a little bit about academia and sort of and responding to climate change. I'm putting him on the spot here unfairly, but I'm hoping he'll say a little bit. And then finally, to my right, we have John Nolt, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Tennessee-Knoxville. He works primarily in philosophical logic and environmental and intergenerational ethics. For the last decade, he has been the chair of UT's Committee on the Campus Environment. We're talking a little bit about at lunch about what it's like to be sort of working for change from within the university system. He has written many books and articles. His most recent book is Environmental Ethics for the Long Term, an introduction. He was also asked to write the entry on future generations for the Oxford Handbook of Environmental Ethics. Of his many articles on climate justice and nuclear power that have appeared, some of which have appeared in Ethics, Policy and the Environment, Climatic Change, Philosophy and Public Issues, And in particular, I wanted to mention greenhouse gas emissions and the domination of posterity in the ethics of global climate change, which is definitely very close to my heart because it was probably the article that most convinced me to start writing about climate change. So I'm very happy to have John here. So I think that we are going to be talking about primarily what are the ways in which different understandings of justice and different sets of values can meaningfully impact the kinds of responses we want and the way we morally evaluate climate change. And so I believe Cory is going to be going first, and he's going to talk specifically about human rights and climate change.
Thank you all very much for coming. You've already introduced me, but I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Cory Caton. I'm a graduate candidate at the philosophy department at St. Louis University, and I just want to say it's an honor to be here, and I'm very excited to share the stage with these incredibly intelligent people. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Smith for organizing this event and asking me to be a part of it. One of the reasons I'm here is that I'm in the midst of writing about climate change and theories of justice to future generations. So basically I get up every day and I engage in philosophical theorizing about justice. What is justice? So when I sat down to respond to the discussion questions that Dr. Smith gave us, I realized that the best way to answer them was simply to tell you what it is that led me to want to get up every day and engage in philosophical theorizing about justice in relation to climate change, never mind to write an entire book about it. So that's what I'm going to tell you. Climate change is one of the most serious global environmental problems that humanity has ever faced. It's widely recognized by scientists that climate change is anthropogenic, that increasing warming will cause increasing economic costs into the future, and will have seriously harmful effects on some individuals, especially the global poor, who are already the most vulnerable. Specifically, it's projected to result in more severe storms, flooding, heat stress, food insecurity, drought, and increased exposure to disease for many people. Moreover, there's also the uncertain possibilities for catastrophic effects that would result from runaway warming, which we don't fully understand. Given these projections, it seems obvious that climate change is a serious moral problem. This is because if we do not appropriately mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and the projections come true, many people will suffer serious deprivations and harms who wouldn't have had we mitigated. To me, it seems clear that by continuing to emit excessive amounts of GHGs, we are doing something unjust to those who will be seriously affected. And yet there has been little effective global action to mitigate in the way scientists argue is required. To keep warming to 2 degrees Celsius, global emissions need to peak and then fall by between 40 and 70% in the next 35 years, says the IPCC. However, 20 years of global negotiations have led to little progress. The closest the developed world came was the Kyoto Protocol, which was a major failure. The collapse of the economy of the USSR in the 90s and the Great Recession of 2008 led to greater global emission reductions than the Kyoto Protocol. So it was this difference between my sense of this clear moral imperative and the lack of effective emission cuts that led me to want to engage in philosophical reflection about justice and climate change. Did others not judge there to be a moral imperative to address climate change that to me seemed evident? As Dr. Smith pointed out, much discussion about climate change is economic. For example, Bjorn Lomborg argues we shouldn't make major GHG emission cuts because the money we would spend on that could be used to greater overall benefit to the world's poor today. On the other side, renowned economists Nicholas Stern and William Nordhaus disagree, and they argue that climate change will lead to major costs to global GDP in the future, and so it makes sense to bear smaller costs today by mitigating. Unlike making more overall good in the world, it is morally imperative not to engage in actions which threaten the basic interests of others. That is why these basic interests in life, security, and subsistence are protected in law in many countries, and they're enshrined in international human rights documents. So it turns out what my initial moral concern was about was the fact that greenhouse gas emissions cause climate change, which create risks to the human rights of others into the future. So to me, philosophical theorizing about justice in regards to climate change can contribute to our understanding of the moral values and the moral duties at stake. I argue that climate change discussion should increasingly appeal to moral duties that are tied to human rights. Of course, we need further theorizing about human rights, about their justification, their moral and legal status, and so on. We also need to theorize about whether future people, the people who are most at threat by climate change as a long-term problem, can have human rights now. How does that make sense? But to me, giving the best theoretical basis for the appeal to human rights in regards to climate change is an integral contribution that political philosophers can make in the interdisciplinary conversation.
It's an honor to be here at Stanford for all the usual reasons, but for me it's especially an honor because you belong to one of the first universities in the world to divest from coal, and that is a tremendous distinction and one that's going to begin, I think, to help change the whole political landscape across the United States. So kudos to Stanford, and I'm more happy to be here for that reason than for any other.
Not the weather.
The weather's fine, but it's a little boring. I got into this business of thinking about climate change as an environmental activist. I've done that for many, many years, most of my adult life. What bothered me about the discourse was that it just seemed to be missing the point. Much of the literature, much of the public literature on climate change had to do with economic effects. You could read about this or that economic cost climate change was going to cause, and that just seemed to me to be reducing to almost absurdity something that I saw to be a vast intergenerational tragedy, something that was almost incomprehensible in scope. And so I was very much opposed to reducing the thinking about climate change to economic terms. The other thing was that there seemed to be a curious duality in the literature. On the one hand, people would say things like, well, it's inevitable, we're going to burn all this fossil fuel and we're going to destroy everything and the human race is going to be going and all that. And that's crazy. We're the most adaptable species that's on this planet. We're not going to destroy ourselves. We're not going to destroy life. We're not going to destroy the planet. So that's completely insane. And yet, that's a big part of the climate discourse. We're just screwed. So why do anything? So that really bothered me. The other thing was, well, if I try to do something, I won't have any effect. Nothing I can do makes any difference anyway, which is another common attitude. So those are the things that have really bothered me about common attitudes about climate change and the things that I've tried to counter in my work. One of the first things I began thinking about was, how do you make sense? How can you count the moral costs of climate change? If I'm interested in moral costs rather than in economic costs or costs of some other kind, how do you make sense of the moral costs? And here are the two answers that I've come up with over time, and they're nothing unusual, but they're so absent from the discourse. One is, how many people are we killing? How many people are we killing right now this year? How many people are the emissions of a university like Stanford killing? Annually or over time? How many people are going to die in total as a result of our fossil fuel emissions? That just hasn't been talked about much in the discourse. And the second thing is, what are we doing to life on Earth? That's gotten some publicity. People talk about biodiversity loss and so on. What's the scale of it? How much is climate change contributing to biodiversity loss? So in my work, I've tried to articulate those things perhaps a little bit better than they have been in the discourse in general. There have been 4 major studies, three major studies on the annual death toll from global climate change currently, from the climate change that we have, which is far less than 2 degrees centigrade, which is the alleged safe level of climate change. The three studies were done, one by the World Health Organization, one by the Global Humanitarian Forum, which is a nonprofit, another by Development Research Associates, which is another nonprofit. They all come up with an annual death toll in the hundreds of thousands globally. That's each year. John Broome, the philosopher and economist, who I understand hangs out at Stanford sometimes, points out in his book Climate Matters that if you can just take the current death toll from climate change and think about it, don't worry about how much it's going to be augmented, but just take the current rate. How many does that add up to by the end of the century? Tens of millions. Okay, we're talking about something on the scale of the casualties of World War II. That's without any additional rate. The DARA report, Development Research Associate report, talks about 700,000, a rate of about 700,000 per year by 2030. Now, there's lots of controversy about those reports. There are extrapolations. There's a lot of assumptions that go into calculating those things. But I think they give us some sense of the moral costs of climate change. And even if they're off by a considerable margin, still the moral costs of climate change are significant. With respect to the question of, does it matter what we do? Does it matter what the individual does? Does it matter what a university does? Does it matter what a corporation does? There are a couple of facts of climate science which some of which were actually misunderstood early. By that I'm talking about like 10 years ago. And neither of which have penetrated into the discourse, the public discourse, all that much. It was for a long time thought that there was a considerable lag time between the temperature increase in the amount of carbon that you put into the atmosphere. Recent studies have refuted that, and essentially what happens is you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the temperature increase is very quick, a small lag time. It's very little. The other is that there are thresholds or below which really there's no harm. Fact is, you put a certain number of molecules of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide absorbs sunlight reflected back from the earth, heat reflected back from the earth. Each carbon dioxide molecule is capable individually of absorbing heat. The more you put in, the more heat you're going to absorb. And the more heat is absorbed, the greater the temperature. The greater the temperature, the greater the harm. There's a continuous function, or almost continuous function, between the amount of carbon dioxide you put into the atmosphere and the increase in temperature, although there are thresholds at which that increases more quickly than others, but it's basically a continuous function, and a continuous function between the increasing temperature and harm. Okay. So that means that every little bit of additional carbon is doing more harm. It's not a matter of threshold. It's not a matter of a little bit doesn't matter. Every little bit matters. We talked about harm to 2100. That's and used a figure, and admittedly it's speculative to some degree, of tens of millions. Global warming does not end in 2100. We don't know how long, how high the temperature is going to get, and we don't know exactly the sensitivity of the atmosphere to carbon dioxide. But we do know that it will take many centuries for the carbon dioxide to be removed from the atmosphere. Unfortunately, the main mechanism of removal is dissolution in the oceans, which creates acidification, which is a problem of its own. Many centuries for the carbon dioxide to come out of the atmosphere, but in the meantime, feedback mechanisms have kicked in, and those are very long-term and slow-acting. So the question is, as we keep putting more and more carbon into the atmosphere, we're going to keep raising the temperature, raising the temperature, raising the temperature. At some point we stop. When we stop, the temperature won't go down. The temperature will plateau, more or less. And that plateau will stay high for centuries, probably millennia. And then you've got a really long tail. And the most recent study I read on this says, this is Proceedings of the National Academy, about 23,000 to 165,000 years is the duration of the elevated temperatures from climate change. If we're killing 100,000 people a year now, and we're talking about a duration of elevated temperature of that level, you really get a sense of the moral importance of this tragedy. Now, we're going to adapt. We're going to do lots of stuff. We'll probably do some geoengineering if we keep going. But that may not help with the tragedy. I was at the Howard Baker Center for Public Policy, which is a institute we have at the University of Tennessee. About 3 weeks ago, we had a talk by a retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General and a retired British Navy Admiral, and they were talking about military preparations for the contingencies of climate change. Mostly what they wanted to talk about was how great both of their militaries are at energy savings. Okay. They didn't want to talk about really what the military preparations were. But when asked pointed questions, they did admit that they were preparing for conflict in the Arctic over drilling rights, and that they were preparing for conflict over mass migrations resulting from climate change. And under those conditions, it's going to be more and more difficult, if there is that kind of military conflict, to deal with the tragedy of climate change. We talk about biodiversity. That is a huge loss because of its duration as well. Here's a quote from Barnowski et al., article from Nature 2011, talking about recovery times for biodiversity once you lose species. And we're losing species due to climate change at a pretty rapid rate. It will accelerate as the heat goes up. Evolution of new species, it takes at least hundreds of thousands of years, and recovery from mass extinction probably occurs on timescales encompassing millions of years. So again, we're looking at some very, very long-term phenomena. This is a moral challenge unlike any that humanity has ever faced, and through my work, I'm hoping to make that clear in a way that the public discourse has not so far made it clear. That's why the work of Stanford in divesting from coal and the work of everybody in this room is crucial in moving us toward a solution to the problem.
Well, what I want to talk about is a little bit is the role of political theory here in this, in relation to this subject of climate change. Political theory is, it's a subdiscipline of political science, and sometimes we use the label political philosophy, which is, and I don't think it matters much which you use, although as political scientists we prefer to call us political theorists to keep the disciplinary boundaries intact. But it's a subdiscipline that is devoted to the analysis of normative and conceptual issues, and which are related to the role of political institutions. So I think it's a slight difference here. John just ended by saying that the moral problem are the moral problems, or emphasizing the moral problems of climate change. But I think as political theorist, I'm very much interested also in the institutional aspects of those moral problems, how they can be, how the ways of organizing and designing political institutions pertain to these questions. And I think there are, broadly speaking, three different kinds of issues that we would be interested in. And we just not issues actually, but three kinds of contributions that political theorists seek to make. And I will just mention them briefly and then go on and exemplify them with reference to work that I have done and also some other people which are related to the issues I'm interested in. So first, you could say that one of the major purposes here of political theory or political philosophy is to be explanatory in a way, to explain the nature of problems. So we don't always have a clear idea of what kind of institutional or normative problems are, for instance, provoked by the fact that we are facing climate change. So I think to identify the problems that we need to resolve is actually one of the main things that political theorists would do. So it's not really providing solutions, but to raise questions and to identify the problem. Second thing would be evaluative, or sort of normative, to evaluate the public policies or the way institutions are designed from the standpoint of specific understandings of what justice or democracy or other concepts mean. To pass judgments on the basis of these starting points in terms of whether these are optimal or non-optimal ways to address these problems. And I just want to comment on that because sometimes people, at least in Sweden, I don't think it's necessarily the same here, would react to me when I say that we have an evaluative purpose in political theory. They would say, how can you pass normative judgment? Isn't that going to reduce to opinions and so forth? Well, the thing is that we always must make clear the sort of normative standpoints from which we make those judgments. So it's not that we're expressing opinions, it's actually how to evaluate the normative implications of certain commitments or principles that we already adhere to. I think that is the function of explaining or the sort of what follows given a certain normative commitment. And I think therefore it's quite important what kind of normative standpoints that we begin from. And I think it's normally quite helpful to start with normative standpoints that are familiar or that we can expect people to share to some degree, at least, some degree. The third issue is critical. And you might think that, well, the other two were also critical. But I'm thinking about critical here in a specific way, critical of bad political theory. So as a political theorist, I'm not just interested in explaining the nature of the problems or evaluating public policies or political institutions. I'm also interested in criticizing other conceptions of political theory that people, academics, or governments or citizens may expound. So now let me give some examples here from the kind of work that I've been interested in, and it relates to problems of democracy and how the idea of democracy is related to climate change. That's not perhaps the first priority, because if what John says is right, I mean it's primarily a moral problem. And as Cory also pointed out, it's very much a problem of justice. But I think democracy is worth taking seriously also in discussions on climate change. First of all, what is the problem here that it makes democracy a relevant one? I think you can see that if you think about the long-term consequence of climate change that previous talkers already mentioned. The long-term consequence of climate change means that future people, unborn generations, will be affected in significant ways. And the problem then is, how can democracy help us to address those problems? Well, the problem here is, as many have pointed out, that democracies seem to be very presentist in a way. Democracy doesn't give a vote or doesn't represent unborn people. Democracy is also characterized by sort of short-termism in a way that electoral cycles provide strong incentives for politicians and for citizens to sort of act in a short-sighted way. So democracy in a way seems to be a problem here rather than perhaps the solution to the creation of policies that have a long-term perspective and that is able to take the interest of future generations into account. So the conclusion here is that there's a tension here between the moral urgency of the problem that John has stressed and democracy. Next, the evaluative dimension. I just want to mention one thing that I've been interested in, which is not directly related to the problem of short-sightedness actually, but it's about how we should evaluate the distribution of costs and responsibilities between nations when it comes to mitigation and reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. As you may know, the Kyoto Protocol stipulates that certain countries should reduce greenhouse gas emissions to considerably. But not all countries are included here. In particular, these burdens are primarily put on developed countries and not so much on developing countries. But there is, I think, something amiss here. And I think the question is about the democratic, the role of democracy in political societies. I think there is a case to be made here that in democratic societies, citizens are to a larger extent complicit in the policies pursued by their governments than in non-democratic societies. So I think in a way, when we live in a democratic society, we do have a responsibility for the kind of policies that our governments are pursuing. And that makes, and I think that is harder to say for authoritarian people living in non-authoritarian countries. Those citizens didn't have a say in making the public policy issues. They didn't have a say in choosing government. So I think this might sound perverse, but in a way I think there is stronger reasons to hold democracies responsible for not living up to the moral urgency of climate change than holding citizens living in authoritarian countries. I think these have some implications that may be potentially upsetting and interesting that we can talk about more. The last thing, I think time is running, the last thing I just want to point at is how we can reform political institutions in a democracy in order to better take the interests of future generations into account. And I think there are, in the literature and the writings of other people, there has been a wealth of different proposals here, all from the ombudsman, introduction of ombudsmen to the introduction of new constitutions which provide strong constitutional protection of future generations, and even to introduce new chambers, upper houses in the parliament, selected on the basis of how well inclined those people are to take this long-term interest into account. And I think here we must have a critical role on some of these proposals. As a sort of democratic theorist, I feel at least very prone to do that. Because we must not just focus on the extent to which a certain way of organizing our political institutions will be beneficial or not to future generations. We must also take into account the democratic character of those institutions. And eventually we may come up with a conclusion, and I think there is a case for that, at least to some extent, that there is a conflict here, there is a tension here at least, between organizing political institutions in a way that is conducive to future generations and their interests on the one hand, and on the other hand, political institutions that are democratic in the way we know democracy and normally wish them to be. So I think there is a potential here for a sort of big normative problem here that we need to address, and that I've tried to write about in a couple of articles before. But yeah, I will stop there and just look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So I'm gonna exercise the right of the moderator to say a couple words before I turn it over to you guys. And what I think is what's really great about the three panelists is that they've all illustrate a different aspect of the ways in which the typical ways of talking about public policy and climate change are a little bit limited. So Cory and John specifically focus on the ways in which there are certain elements, certain wrongs, certain harms, certain considerations that are perhaps not given their full weight by say, economic analysis. Imagine if it was the case that just that was the result of volcanic activity, or it was the result of the sun emitting more energy. How would we think about the moral issues and the distributional consequences and the different ways of evaluating various public policy responses in that world versus this world? Now, why do I think that matters? Because from the standpoint of human rights violations and from the standpoint of economic analysis, it makes no difference whether we are doing it or whether it's something that's happening to us. Right? It doesn't make any difference. And so I'm tempted to think that this is actually a very strong limitation. This is a very strong limitation on the way we tend to think about it. We tend to think about these public policy questions when we're doing the normative analysis as if these things were bolts out of the blue and not as if they were things that were done by some people to other people. And then we try to reintroduce that later on, right? But I think there's a real sense in which the public policy debate is limited and hobbled by this way of thinking about the values at stake. And so I really think it matters deeply that this is something that people are doing to other people. And that's something that I just wanted to mention. When you think about how cheap, like say stratospheric sulfate injections are. So this is where we lower the temperature of the planet by injecting particles into the atmosphere that will reflect more of the sun's light out into space. This is called solar radiation management, and this is one of the proposed engineering processes. And it looks good because, Bill Gates or Richard Branson or Elon Musk could do it himself. It's that cheap, right? And or a Bond villain. I think I'm not sure if it's Moonraker, but it's like there's like an actual Bond movie about where the villain is re-engineering the climate in this sort of way. And so, what's the problem with that? It's super cheap. It will lower the temperature of the planet, let's say. And I just want to say, notice that we're treating this as a public policy problem, as a set of impacts to be avoided. We're not, but I think when you think about it in a different way, where you think about what we're doing is that we are imposing costs on people, and then we don't want to pay the bill of avoiding those costs, so we're going to do this cheap geoengineering that's going to redirect those costs to other people, right? So we have a runaway train that's going to run some people over. We could stop the train at cost to us, but instead we're going to redirect it to another track that's going to kill a bunch of other people. And here's the key point, where we're responsible for the train being run away in the first place. I find that to be a morally sort of unsatisfying kind of response for that sort of reason. But again, right, if you look at it economically, there's a lot to be said for it. A lot to be said against it, but a lot to be said for it.
What you do is by geoengineering, you up international tensions, which are already going to be very, very high as a result of the impacts of climate change that you have already. So you increase the probability of global chaos by doing this. It's not a simple solution. There are always unintended consequences of this sort of thing. The other thing is, it may look cheap to put sulfate aerosols in the air, but when you start thinking about now having to deal with the consequences of putting sulfate aerosols in the air and the fact that that doesn't do anything to save the oceans from acidification and so on, it is so much cheaper just to leave the fossil fuels in the ground. It is so much cheaper. Methane is a fairly short-lived greenhouse gas. It comes out of the atmosphere fairly quickly, whereas CO2 is much longer lived. So those long-term consequences that I was talking about are much more due to the CO2 than to the methane.
So the first question, I understand, is that was about the scientific consensus concerning climate change. Scientific consensus concerning climate change. What about the people that deny it in some important aspects of the consensus? And the second I thought was about the effect of the solar system. I think so. Do you mean by the sun's emission of energy? So I guess so. I think part of this is partly we're political philosophers and political theorists, and so to a certain extent, our ability to sort of evaluate scientific disputes is limited. But I think what we're going for, I think the idea is that this is a pretty solid scientific consensus, all things considered. In fact, it's extraordinarily solid. And so from the standpoint of, this is just me personally, from the standpoint of sort of political philosophy, what I do is there's a little conditional check mark on it, which is like, if the scientific consensus is correct, then this is what the moral considerations are. I don't take it to be my job to necessarily evaluate the scientific consensus, although I will say that I accept it as solid. It looks pretty good to me. But that's how I imagine the relationship. I don't know if anyone else has anything to say about that aspect of it.
Science runs on deniers, right? So science is pushed forward by people who disagree with established evidence and established theory, right? So, but when 97% of scientists agree to the theory, and we want those 3%. We don't want them to go away. We want them to say it could be the sun, it could be the Earth, it could be the orbit, it could be and so what they do is they continuously test the theory. And if the theory survives that testing, that's the best theory we have, and that's the theory we should work on. That's the way scientific theories work. All scientific theories have people who disagree with them, and that makes the theories better over time. So that's my perspective on climate denial. That's great. I support those people, but the consensus is that the theories we have are the best theories that we have.
I'd like to add just one more thing to that. Most of the so-called climate deniers or climate skeptics have either ideological or financial reasons for doing so. There's about 3% of them of the scientists who are in that category. You mentioned the solar radiation argument. That comes basically from one guy who advertises himself as a Harvard astrophysicist. His name is Willie Soon. He is funded almost entirely by the fossil fuel industry. And he is not an astrophysicist, nor is he at Harvard. So he's a fraud. And he's been exposed in the media, the New York Times and other places just recently.
And maybe I do one quick thing, is that I actually think that part of what's a little bit of things that's driving a little bit the climate denial, or provides space for the climate denial, is in part people have sort of this folk philosophy of science, by which the only way we can come to have reliable scientific knowledge is they imagine something along the lines of like high energy physics or something like that. And so when we look at other scientific enterprises that are well justified but have different practices, people tend to look at them a little bit more skeptically. So I actually think there's a little bit of philosophy going on in the background, but I think there's always philosophy going on in the background, so that's not surprising.
In the last 12 years or 15 years, it hasn't been an increase in the global average temperature, which is an anomaly given what the previous predictions were, but it's still a very strong increase in the global average temperature that has taken place in the 20th century. But the point is rather, I'm not a scientist, and no one else in this panel is. So I couldn't really judge, about the science. So but the question is, how should we, who are not doing climate science, relate to what climate scientists say? And I think my view is that we should relate to it in the same way as we do in relation to, for instance, what the medical scientists do. If I want to have a therapy, if I have a diagnosis for a certain illness, well, I would go for the majority of medical scientists, what they say. I wouldn't opt for this advice that just a minority would say. I would put my bet on that the majority is right on this question. So I have no reason to question climate science if climate scientists, the majority of them that is of an opinion that this is taking place.
I actually think I think this conversation actually raises a very interesting question, right? Which is that what should be the relationship between the climate scientists and the person like us that's presenting these sorts of new normative considerations? Because one thing that you could have many views about this. One view might be that nobody who's not a climate scientist should talk about climate change impacts. I think the climate scientists might actually, they might be in favor of that. I don't know, that's not fair. But so you could do that, right? it's clearly the case that like we have an academic division of labor, right? I'm not going to be building climate models, right? I also am not going to be in a position to evaluate at the very deepest level those climate models. But it's also the case that presumably I learn things that climate scientists and policymakers could, if we've convinced you. There are things that we've done, there are things that we know that are worth being part of the conversation. So what we really have to have here is like an interdisciplinary conversation where everybody's talking to each other. And that's actually complicated, it's difficult to do. I was just in Germany for a climate engineering conference, and they had breakout sessions, and all the political theorists and political philosophers went to the political theory, political philosophy breakout session, and all the climate scientists went to the climate science breakout session, and we never talked to each other the entire conference. And this was described as an interdisciplinary conference. Anyway, my point is that these conversations indicate the need to have both people that can answer the model question and the people that can answer the normative theory question. And it's very difficult to imagine people being experts in both simultaneously, although perhaps not impossible.
Who should bear the costs of climate mitigation and adaptation? And one perspective is to ask questions: who is responsible for the problem? Who caused the problem? And to think that is relevant. The other perspective is to ask who is capable of addressing the problem. And it doesn't always follow that those who have caused the problem are also those best suited to address the problem. But of course, in this case, in climate change, we will normally see that the developed countries that have produced emissions for hundreds of years are also among the richest countries. So that sort of coincides in this case. But I would just like to sort of emphasize the distinction here, but also in relation to what you talked about before, that, there's one thing, we don't necessarily have to dig into the question of who has caused this problem. How should we distribute the burdens in relationship to this sort of historical emissions? So, we could go that way, but we don't necessarily have to go that way. We can just ask, okay, there's a problem here. People will die, as John has emphasized, and who are the states, who are the corporations, who are the individuals that are best equipped to do something about it?
I just want to make a comment. I gave those statistics on death counts. I believe it's either 90 or 95% of those deaths are in developing nations, primarily in Africa and Southeast Asia. So that's where the costs are being paid currently.
And so what I would want to emphasize a little bit, is along sort of what Ludvig is saying, is that these claims about responsibility or ability to pay, these are all substantive normative commitments that people have, right? And so it's not the case that you can escape the normative questions about how we should distribute those benefits and burdens. So if you want to hear my long answer about how historical responsibility should play a role in the distribution of these entitlements, then we should have dinner and we'll talk about it. But what I want to emphasize here is that it's not obvious that being an expert at getting elected or being an expert at designing climate models also makes you an expert at figuring out the question of whether responsibility or ability to pay is the correct normative framework for distributing the burdens of mitigation and adaptation. That broad claim is kind of what I want to defend.
It's increasing in religious organizations to be focused on the environment, and the Pope is actually going to come out with, I don't know if it's an encyclical or what exactly it's called, but to address climate change and the environment and questions of the environment from the Catholic perspective. So it is increasing, and I think religious organizations are realizing that part of the structure, the moral structure of their religions entail a kind of perspective of stewardship to the natural world, and obviously care and concern about the poor and the developing world and future people who have no say today on the decisions we make that will affect them.
I think there's a lot of movement. I think the list now is some 30 major religious organizations, and I believe that's just in the United States, have joined the movement to divest from fossil fuels, including my denomination. I'm a Unitarian Universalist. And I know that it's being discussed at high levels in other denominations. I was talking not long ago with a person who's been working with the Presbyterian Church on this issue, and although they decided not to divest, that was a close call. So this is, I think, in a lot of ways quite reminiscent of civil rights. It's taken a lot of time to get started, but the momentum is certainly picking up.
And I would suggest, I mean, my church, the Episcopalian Church, right, the drive on marriage equality was primarily, I mean, in many ways was grassroots. There were the acceptance of gay bishops, gay deacons, gay priests, in many ways occurred at the lower level before it was ever sort of represented at the highest levels of the church. So in some sense, I think that there's a grassroots movements are probably going to be more successful in the long run. One of the ways in which you might get movement, and this I don't know how practical this is, but one of the ways in which you might get movement is that with the sort of economic analysis or with the public policy problem kind of analysis, then the fairness of the deliberative procedures is only instrumentally relevant. Whereas I think that one of the reasons why international adjudications and conferences have not moved the needle very far is in part because they view the fairness of the deliberations and the specifically who gets to deliberate, who gets to vote, how does it work. Even internally, just the internal process of the deliberations are not designed to compensate for deep unfairnesses within the global order. And so as a result, I think there's a lot of sense in which they lack legitimacy, they're not particularly obligatory and that kind of thing. And I think that the reason why people are just unconcerned about that is in part because they have an unsatisfying view of what precisely the fairness and the deliberations and the conferences are supposed to achieve. And so if we switch over and look at it slightly differently, then I think people would be more compelled by those sorts of considerations. But that is speculative politics of the first order.
There were last fall in New York 400,000 people marching at a climate march in New York City. I think when we get 1 million in Washington, people will listen. There is this divestment movement that I've alluded to a couple of times now that is taking hold. And a great number of universities are talking about it. I know it's being debated right now at Oxford and Cambridge. I don't know what the outcome of that's going to be. But those things matter. They're going to change the political landscape.
I see a human rights approach to climate change, moving to a human rights approach as opposed to a focus on the economics, right? The economists agree, right? We're wasting social wealth, right? We can spend less money now or more money later, right? We're going to pay the cost of climate change, right? So they agree on that. But I think that a human rights approach can add to that conversation. I'm not disagreeing with them, but I'm just saying that a human rights approach also recognizes that those costs are going to be to the basic interests of some people, right? They're not just going to be broad economic costs. They're going to be costs to subsistence farmers, to Inuit people, to climate refugees whose lives will be disrupted. And those basic interests, most people think, and a human rights approach supports the idea, that those basic interests are of extreme moral weight. And protecting those and ensuring that all human beings have that basic level of well-being is what a human rights approach aims for. And so that's, I think it's a morally weighty kind of obligation. So that's why I'm pushing a human rights approach to basically give the best theoretical grounding for that approach. It's going to take legal innovations, I think. There have been cases brought in front of human rights tribunals and even to the US Supreme Court. And those courts ruled that the standards of legal harm were not met. And so they rejected those cases. They said the harm wasn't imminent, it wasn't clear, there wasn't enough information, and so on. And so they felt like they couldn't apply the legal standards of harm. And I think it's going to take some legal innovation to recognize the way that human rights are at play in climate change. And I think that can contribute to the urgency in Paris, in a couple of months. But I think over the longer term, it can.
I'm skeptical of the sort of just big emitters solution for a couple of reasons. One is that we're going to have to come up with an agreement that's fundamentally consistent with the fact that lots of countries still need to develop. And so I would be worried. And so this is again bringing in moral considerations that are often so right now there are a lot of people who deal with climate change. They deal entirely with simply preventing emissions without recognizing what I think is morally very important, which is that the big 20 will have to reduce their emissions even more than we initially think, because there are other countries that are going to need to develop and they're going to need to emit more than they are. And so there's a consideration there. And so if we get the big 20 hammering out an agreement and setting up a set of entitlements to emit, then it's going to be very difficult to get people to move on the fact that they need to drop below that, because there are some countries in the world that just need to emit more because they need to develop. And there are people who are suffering very severe consequences from lack of development that are just as bad as what people are going to suffer from climate change. And I feel like we have to keep both of those targets in sight when we're thinking about the international institutions that are going to generate these sorts of agreements.
We're wary to set limits on how many children people can have, because we think that reproductive choice is an important sphere. And so we have solutions that don't necessarily threaten those values. For example, increasing the price of emitting carbon so that people use less of it to meet our targets. So I think you're right that those solutions can lead to a decrease in emissions, but they threaten certain other values that we would hope we could protect while reducing emissions.
I would like to comment also on that question. It is true that lowering population would considerably reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it may be that we'll get to the point where that will be one of the things that we'll have to do. I think we should lower population anyway. There are ways of doing it that are non-coercive. One is to make universally available free birth control for everyone. That should certainly be a policy that everyone ought to pursue, so that everybody who doesn't want to have children has the choice not to have children. That's the first step that we ought to take. The second thing is to provide adequate education and opportunities for women around the world. That will do a great deal to lower the birth rate. We may have to do more than that. Our population is projected to go to about 11 billion by the end of the century. It's hard to imagine how we're going to get to a stable anything with that size of a population.
People just don't think about carbon emissions as like something that they could be entitled to or not entitled to. I think there's just so I think the first step in sort of convincing people that carbon taxes are necessary is to get them to conceptualize their carbon emissions as a resource that they're using. I actually think that most people don't even think about it that way when they don't think about the social price of driving their car to Santa Cruz as a thing that like consuming gasoline. They don't think they're consuming atmosphere when they do that. They just don't think about it that way. And I think that we're not going to, so partly we'd have to just get people to conceptualize it that way. So unfortunately, we can't keep you any later. I hope people will come out and ask some more questions, but we're also going to do dinner just down the hall.